Analysis and due diligence appraisals and using the appraised value. Let's talk about appraisals. The value as assessed by a licensed appraiser, that's an appraised value. And these are actually required by lenders when getting a new loan. It costs typically about $450 to get an appraisal. Could be a little more, could be a little less. Typically takes 2 to 3 days to schedule and complete an appraisal. The subject property getting appraised is defined in terms of its square footage, and that's the amount of square footage, size of the property based on how much of that property is actually air conditioned by a centralized HVAC system. Plus also taken into consideration is the garage square footage and other footage like covered porches, etc. So there's the main square footage, and then there's the other parts of the property that are compared to other comparable properties. 3 or more comparable properties are selected from the area. So the way the value is determined is by finding 3 other hopefully similar properties within the area, hopefully same subdivision, and then comparing the subject property to those properties. Appraisers are only allowed to compare the property to other properties that have sold in the last 6 months or less. And they are trying to find properties that are preferably in the same subdivision and that are preferably approximately the same size, or at least within a few hundred square feet in size, and also within the same age or within a few years of the same age. Sometimes there are no comps. So in a very large and mature subdivision with lots of similarly priced homes and lots of homes selling, appraisers may not have a hard time meeting their required goal of using similar properties that have sold in the last 6 months. But if you're trying to get an appraisal done in a small subdivision, in a rural area, in an area where there have been very few or little sales, in a local downtown area where the properties are all very, very different, in many different situations, there are no comparable properties, and in these cases, the appraiser looks further and further away until they find something. In other words, the appraisers are actually regulated by the industry to be required to use only recent comps within the last 6 months and to find comparable or similar properties. And if there are none, then the appraised value can really get wonky because they are forced to do things that don't make any sense, and the value they come up with may not make any sense. So the value is always determined as the average dollar per square foot of properties in the area times the square footage of the property. So in other words, if the average home in the area sells for $100 per square foot and the subject property is 1,000 square feet, then the appraised value will come out to 100 times 1,000, which is $100,000. And then the appraiser makes line item adjustments for, considerations that are somewhat subjective. In other words, this is worth a little more or less, or this is a little better or a little worse for the number of bathrooms, garages, rooms, location, lot size, site value, age, condition, construction quality, finishes, fixtures. So all of these little adjustments, have a little bit of subjectivity associated with them. At the end of the day, though, it mostly comes down to the size of the property and the location of the property. Those are the vast majority of how you determine value, no matter how you determine value. Appraisers are professionally liable for making sure the appraisals are not higher than the market value of the home. Appraisers are scared to death that they will over-appraise a property and they can actually lose their license because the lender will actually potentially sue them if a house is overappraised and then the homeowner goes into default and the lender can't resell the property for what the appraisal said it was worth. So they're also pressured not only to give you lower appraisals, but they're pressured by the mortgage brokers not to be lower than the contract price. In other words, the mortgage broker goes to the appraiser and says, hey, if this thing doesn't appraise for $100,000, I can't do the loan and I can't afford to hire you anymore. So appraisers are typically always right at the contract price. Isn't that interesting? If a house sells for $100,000, it's pretty typical that the appraised value comes in right at $100,000 or maybe a few $1,000s above. Sometimes it's a little bit lower just because the appraiser's scared, so he has to drop the price a little bit, which is really a bad thing for the seller, because then the seller has to drop their price, or the buyer can't get a loan. Are never more than a few $1,000s higher. So it would be very unusual for somebody to sell a house for $100,000 and it appraises for $120,000, even if it's worth $120,000. So, for example, a property worth $300,000 as is that you get under contract for $225,000 because you got a smoke and screaming deal from a motivated seller, it will still probably only appraise for about $230,000. Even though it's worth $300,000, and even though you could resell it for $300,000, the appraiser will never appraise it for much more than it's worth, because they're going to be reluctant to say that it's worth, especially if you're getting a bank loan. They don't want to show that it's worth that much more. And, interesting tangent, if an appraisal actually did come in much higher than the property's value, we actually had a deal one time where we sold a house that was worth $200,000. And we sold it for $160,000. It was a fast wholesale deal, and the appraisal came in at like $195,000, and the bank freaked out. They said, we're not going to approve the loan. I don't know why, but because it overappraised. So we had to keep getting it reappraised until we got a lower appraisal. Okay, tips. The appraised value is not what the property is worth. Now, this is a big misconception by especially new real estate investors. They think, I got to figure out what this thing's worth. I'll get an appraisal. The appraisal is not about what the property is worth. It's more accurately what the lender would be willing to lend on it, okay? And it may be that that's what the property is worth, but it may not be what that property is worth. The appraisers really work for the lenders to determine what a lender could safely lend on a property. We would never, as real estate investors, waste our money having a property appraised just to figure out what its market value is. If you want to figure out its market value, what you're going to realistically be able to resell it for, it's much cheaper and faster and more accurate to have a realtor do a CMA. Okay, that's what we use to determine the value. Some other tips. Appraisers are not allowed to use some of the techniques that a realtor or an investor might use to more accurately determine value. We talked about this a little bit earlier. For example, old comparables. Sometimes there are no properties of comparable size, shape, location, whatever, within the area that an appraisal could use. So it may be that 6 months ago, 6 other properties sold for $250,000, but they can't look at those 6 other properties because they're all over 6 months old. The sales were over 6 months old. So in other words, in those situations, the appraiser would rather find or be forced to find a property that's 30 miles away in a totally different subdivision that's not even remotely comparable, but that's what they are forced to use because the data is more current within the last 6 months. Another example, old comps on a busy street, not next to railroad tracks, power lines, etc., are not by themselves useful. In other words, if you are looking on a house and the house you're looking at is on a busy street, but all of your comparables within the same subdivision are not on a busy street, like you're at the entrance backed up to a highway, or your particular property is on backs up to railroad tracks. Now, you may have other comps that are in the subdivision that are good comps, except they don't back up to the busy street, or they are not next to the power lines. So an appraiser cannot use those comps. They're not comparable. However, or they can use them by making giant subjective comparables. But you can use them in different ways. So I'll give you an example. I might have a property where I back up to a busy street, and there are no comparable sales within the last 6 months. But if I look back a year, I can see that historically, whenever the properties that are on the busy street sold, they always sold for, 25% less than the properties that are not on the busy street. Or sometimes we have properties where some of the properties have a great view because they're on the edge of a mountain, or they even back up and have waterfront, whereas on the other side of the street, they don't have waterfront. Well, they're really not comparables. There's a huge difference between being on the water and not being on the water. So if you don't have recent sales, there's no way to figure out what your property is actually worth. But if you go back and look at old data and you see that the property that are on the water always sell for twice the price, the property that is on the busy street is always at 25% less valuable. The properties that are under the power lines are always 10% less value. That's useful to know that there's always a historic discount for certain problems in a certain area and a certain historic reward compared to the other properties for a certain feature compared to other properties. So knowing what that historic difference is, the penalty or reward is, can be useful if you're buying a property to try to figure out what a property might more accurately be worth. And another set of tips, we might have an appraisal done. We said typically we wouldn't pay to have an appraisal done, but if we're having trouble trying to figure out a very unusual property and what it's worth, we might go ahead and get an appraisal done. Why? Because we know that when we sell the property, the buyer is going to get an appraisal done. So if we're really not sure what a property is worth or what it would more accurately appraise for, even though it might be very valuable, we might go ahead and get an appraisal done just to see what an appraisal would come up with, so that we can show that appraisal to a prospective buyer to prove that the home is worth what we say it's worth. Now, on the other hand, I've seen situations where somebody has a property and the property is just 3 times bigger than any other property in the area. So they get an appraisal and the appraisal says the house is worth, not 3 times the value of all the other properties in the neighborhood, but it's only worth maybe 1.5 times the value of all the other properties in the neighborhood because they had to go 30 miles away to find a comparable property within the last 6 months. And 30 miles away, it was a much less valuable subdivision. So, what is that property really worth? Well, the truth is it's subjective. But the other part of the truth is that whatever the appraiser says it's worth, that's all the lender is going to loan to buy it. So even if it's really the Taj Mahal, but it's surrounded by a bunch of shanties, it's not going to be valued more than 1.5 times the value of a shanty, no matter how nice it is. So that's why sometimes if you have a really oddball property, an appraisal might be useful because it'll give you an idea of what the appraisal will come into and what somebody could get a loan to buy the property at. The other thing that you need to be sensitive of is sometimes the appraised value can change suddenly and even dramatically up or down based on recent sales within the 6-month window. I'll give you a perfect example of that. I one time bought a property and I fixed it up and I got super lucky. In the 6 months that I owned the property, right before I went to sell the property, 2 properties sold in the area at a really, really high price. And what was also really lucky is when I bought the property and right before I bought the property, there were a bunch of properties that sold for a very low price. Well, by the time I went to sell my property, the price that I paid and the price that the other buyers paid, 6, 7, 8 months earlier, those data points could not be used by the appraiser. So those numbers went away, and the only numbers the appraiser could use was the 2 properties that recently sold at a super high price. So the value of my property went up very dramatically from an appraised value in a very short amount of time just because the old data wasn't used and the new data was used. Okay, one last set of tips. If you must resell a property you bought on the MLS within 6 months, and most of the time it's not just if you must resell it, if you want to resell it, or if you do resell a property that you bought in the MLS within the last 6 months, the appraiser will use your purchase price as a data point, as a comp for itself. And this is a big problem because as investors, we buy properties wholesale at big discounts and we sell them retail. So your own purchase of the property and the recording price of that property purchase will screw up the comps for the entire area for 6 months. So if you bought the property for 100 and then you go sell it for 200, the appraiser is going to say, oh, your property sold for 100,000 in the last 6 months, and they're going to use that property and that price to bring down the average prices of all the properties in the area. So how do you avoid that? Well, one is if it's a longer term deal, like more than 6 months, you don't have that problem. The other way to avoid that is just don't buy properties in the MLS. I don't like to buy properties in the MLS. Only 1 out of 10 or 15 properties I buy are in the MLS. I mean, sometimes I'll look for a deal. I don't care where I get the deal. But most of the time I'm not buying in the MLS, and this is one of the reasons. Of course, the better reason is because most of the time the best deals are not in the MLS. But another workaround you can think about is to not record the sales price. Now, there's 2 ways to do this. In some states, you're not required to record the sale of the property in the MLS. Most of the time, if there is a realtor who's listing the property, most of the time the realtor is required to post the sales data back into the MLS. So a workaround might be to fire the realtor before the sale, or make a deal with the seller where the seller is basically working directly with you and not paying the commission to the realtor, or maybe you're paying the realtor a sales fee, but it's not actually listed in the MLS. In other words, the property is withdrawn from the MLS, and then you buy the property. You may or may not make a deal with the realtor, and the deal might be something like, if you agree to release the listing and if you agree to not record the sales price, I will hire you, Mr. Realtor, to resell the property at the higher price after I get it all fixed up. And you'll make an even bigger commission because you'll have a more sellable property because it'll be all fixed up at a higher price. So things like that to get the realtor to not record the sales price and to get it withdrawn from the MLS before it's bought will keep the sales price from being recorded in the MLS. The other thing you could do is inflate the sales price. So if you're going to buy a property for $100,000 and spend $50,000 fixing it up, well, you could just say to the seller, I want to buy it for $150,000, but I want to record a $50,000 repair allowance on the purchase. So in other words, you're going to get $50,000 of that back to go to your contractor to fix the house up, and thus the sales price will not be recorded as $100,000. It'll be recorded as $150,000, which will get you a lot closer to what you're going to be ultimately able to resell the property for. So you need to make sure that you're aware of this issue of, if you buy a property and you plan to resell it in a short amount of time, meaning less than 6 months, the sales price, if it is recorded, may come back to haunt you. Of course, the other workaround is you can just wait until the 6 months has passed and then try to sell it then. But these are things you have to consider. And then finally, in the document library, and if you want, you can download a copy of an appraisal. There's a copy that's shown here on the screen. Obviously, this is too small to be able to read it and go through it, but it's a good idea to just become familiar by looking at a couple of appraisals of kind of how the paperwork works, because if you look at it, it's pretty self-explanatory how appraisers actually make their decisions in terms of coming up with values for properties.